Next, we'll hear from Dr. Vinay Gidwani, Assistant Professor of Geography and Global Studies at the University of Minnesota and a recently named McKnight Land Grant Professor. As a child, Dr. Gidwani moved from a rural village in western India to New Delhi, at which point he was exposed to the disparity between affluence and poverty for the first time. This fostered his interest in studying inequality, and his current research focuses on the regional and national implications of globalization for labor migration and social movements in India, incorporating multiple disciplines including geography, anthropology, and economics. Dr. Gidwani received his PhD from the University of California, Berkeley, a Master's of Forest Science from Yale University, and a bachelor's degree from Bowdoin College. Today, Professor Gidwani is giving a Marjorie Dilley and International Relations endowed lecture titled The Right to Waste, Informal Sector Recyclers and Struggles for Social Justice in Urban India. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Gidwani.
Thank you. Just want to test this mic. Does it work? Can you hear me back at the end of the room? Perfect. Thank you. So I want to begin, first of all, by thanking Doug, Jane, Amy, and Keely for inviting me to the Goodwin Nearing Center and to this splendid conference, and also to Professor Sunil Bhatia, who I haven't met yet, but perhaps he's in the audience somewhere. Ordinarily at this time in the afternoon, I'd be feeling a bit drowsy, but after those rousing and vivid talks, it's hard to. I want to go out and do something. So the talk I want to give today has multiple intersections with what you've heard already from Kristen and Robert. And the title of this talk, The Right to Waste, as some of you may have guessed, is meant as a pun. The right to waste, those who claim the right to produce waste, the affluent, and those who claim the right to generate livelihoods from this waste, the poor. And this becomes, in a strange and curious way, a site of conflict, not just in India, but in many parts of the world. But I want to begin with a literary digression. Some of you may have read Italo Calvino. This is a book he wrote in 1974 called Invisible Cities. It's a book of fantastical stories where Calvino depicts the Venetian traveler Marco Polo regaling the aged Emperor Kublai Khan with stories of cities that he has observed in his wide-ranging travels across Kublai Khan's empire. Kublai Khan is aged, and he senses the impending unraveling of his empire, and Marco Polo regales him with these stories, and one story is of a city called Leonia. And just very briefly, I want to read it out to you because I think it has tremendous contemporary resonance. So Marco Polo describes Leonia. On the sidewalks, encased in spotless plastic bags, the remains of Leonia await the garbage truck. Not only squeeze tubes of toothpaste, blown out light bulbs, newspapers, containers, wrappings, but also boilers, encyclopedias, pianos, porcelain dinner services. Nobody wonders where. Each day they, the street cleaners, carry their load or refuse. Outside the city, surely, but each year the city expands, and the street cleaners have to fall farther back. The bulk of the outflow increases, and the piles rise higher, become stratified, extend over a wider perimeter. Besides, the more Leonia's talent for making new materials excels, the more rubbish improves in quality, resists time, the elements, fermentations, combustions. A fortress of indestructible leftovers surrounds Leonia, dominating it on every side like a chain of mountains. This is from 1974, and this might as well be describing our current urban future, right? So the talk has 6 parts, and sadly I'm going to demand your attention. It's going to actually work your brains at a time in the afternoon when you may not particularly be keen to have those gray cells working. I want to begin by talking about this concept of a need economy, a term that was coined by a late Indian economist in a brilliant book he wrote in 2007 called Rethinking Capitalist Development. In Rethinking Capitalist Development, Sanyal distinguishes between 2 domains of the economy. What he calls the need economy or the survival economy, and the second that he calls the accumulation economy or the profit-oriented economy. You can also think of the need economy and the accumulation economy as roughly cognate to terms that may be more familiar to you, the informal sector and the formal sector. And Sanyal has very evocative descriptions of the need economy. Now, before I get to Sanyal's descriptions, I want to show you what is a rather startling statistics. When I ran across this the first time, which was a few years ago, it floored me completely. What this shows you is the percentage of employment in India today in the survival economy, the need economy, and the percentage employed in the accumulation or the formal economy. And you can see that the numbers are quite startling. The need economy employs 92.7% of India's working population. The accumulation economy employs 7.3%. And these are numbers that were generated by a Government of India commission that I will momentarily talk about. If you're surprised, so was I. So what is this need economy? Sanyal describes it in a variety of ways, but what he primarily wants to point out is that it's the processes that are occurring in the accumulation economy that are driving the growth of the need economy. In other words, processes of accumulation in one domain of the economy, a relatively small proportion in terms of employment generation, is driving the proliferation of need economies where people are struggling to survive, to simply generate livelihoods. And this is the connection that he wants to evoke, in which is why he says that the point to be stressed is that the sub-economy is the result of exclusion, which is to say people who would want a job in the formal economy simply can't get a job in the formal economy. Does that sound familiar? Simply can't get a job in the formal economy and have to figure out ways to survive. This idea of the need economy, of course, has antecedents. Sanyal draws on the work of the Latin American scholar Jose Nun, who in 2000 wrote a provocative article called The End of Work and the Marginal Mass Thesis, in which Nun contends that in many parts of the world there is the emergence of surplus populations that are simply irrelevant to the formal sector of the economy, and in the worst of cases, poses jeopardy to the continued existence of this formal sector. So aside from presenting a political problem, because you have such a large mass of people simply struggling to survive, the growth of this non-functional surplus population also casts aspersion on what has been for long a sacred cow of development economic theory, which is the idea of a dual economy model which predicts a transition from a traditional to a modern mode of production, right? So one of the things that Sanyal is trying to do, and which is why his work is in some ways so provocative, is to rethink the trajectory of development and economic growth in countries like India over the last 60 years, but also alongside that, the very apparatus of knowledge that has emerged to explain this trajectory of growth. And some of you may know that development economics as a profession derives much of its modeling prowess from the Indian experience, particularly Indian experience in the 50s and the 60s. India was a thriving site for the production of this new knowledge that now trucks under the name of development economics. So what Sanyal is doing is really predicting the death of dual economy models. And this is very schematically, I've distilled the arguments of his book into this summary. There is uneven processes of development in rural areas and urban fringes, which leads to mass migration of populations to cities. These populations cannot find jobs in the formal sector of the capitalist economy. This compels the emergence of a sub-economy that comes to be called the informal sector, and this informal sector becomes then the target of management by governments precisely because the populations in this informal sector pose simultaneously a political problem for governments as well as an economic problem for governments. Now, some of you here may be aware that this term informal sector actually has a much older lineage. It's a term that emerges in the 1970s, thanks primarily to the work of economic anthropologists like Keith Hart, but also Harold Wolpe in South Africa, who are working around these problems which they are witnessing in African cities, namely the presence of this informal sector that seems to be a site for all kinds of livelihood activities that don't neatly fit into either the traditional or the modern description of an economy. And the informal sector in their work is primarily cast as this transitional phase between the traditional and the modern. What Sanyal does is he says, look, this informal sector has now become a more or less permanent feature of countries like India. And what this means is, of course, that we have to rethink the very nature of development economics and the predictions that it makes. Sanyal is also in conversation with an Indian political scientist who some of you may know, a person called Partha Chatterjee, who has, in a series of books and articles, made a political argument that functions analogously to Sanyal's economic argument. Partha Chatterjee very briefly says, look, there is in countries like India a domain which we can recognize as civil society, which is the site of full citizenship, people who have recourse to law and are visible in the eyes of the state. And then you have a domain which he calls political society, which consists of a large mass of people who are more or less, to different degrees, invisible in the eyes of the state and must actively coordinate, must cooperate, must project moral claims on the state in order to be even recognized by the state and become claimant to state resources. And what Sanyal is doing is really giving us a way to think about civil society and political society in economic terms as need economy and accumulation economy. This is the report that I was talking about. It's popularly known as the Arjun Sengupta Commission. Produced a report in 2007. It was a commission constituted by the government of India. And when the report came out, it was so controversial in the eyes of the Indian government that the Prime Minister of India suppressed the recommendations of the report. This is a bleak assessment from the report where the Arjun Sengupta Commission pronounces that at the end of 2004 or 5, about 77% of the population was living below 20 rupees, which is approximately 40 cents per day, and constituted most of India's informal economy. About 79% of these informal workers belonged to this group without any legal protection of their jobs or working conditions, or without any social security, living in abject poverty, and excluded, as they sarcastically observe, from all the glory of shining India. Now, this is a particularly politically charged report precisely because it arrives at a time, this is before the Great Recession struck India as well, but it arrives at a time when the Indian economy is galloping along at growth rates, GDP growth rates of about 8 or 9% per year, right? And of course, everybody is celebrating, especially state officials. This report really casts a damper on what has been called sort of the growth miracle of India. And I just want to point out some statistics from this report, which again, they extract from data that has been generated by other Government of India agencies, which is what makes it all the more damning, right? If you look at these statistics, I want you to focus on the ones that I've highlighted in red. This is the informal sector and employment in the informal sector. If you look at 1999-2000 and 2004-2005, employment in the informal sector rises. If you look at the formal sector, the accumulation economy, employment really doesn't rise. In fact, it might have shrunk a little bit. And what this implies, of course, is that employment generation in this phase, which is associated with India's growth miracle, has primarily been in the informal sector, or, as the report points out, through the informalization of what were previously formal sector jobs. And so the conclusion, therefore, I don't need to really reiterate this, is that the increase in total employment in this pivotal period has been primarily of an informal kind. What's missing, of course, from Sanyal's framework and from the Arjun Sengupta Commission's imagination of this informal sector is the geographies and the heterogeneity of these need economies. One of the pitfalls of their framework is that they tend to think of this informal sector and the formal sector in mutual exclusion, when in fact anyone here who has even the barest understanding of livelihoods in the informal sector knows that the formal and the informal are actually interdigitated, right? They are locked in this embrace, so that things produced in the informal sector are absolutely critical for the survival of the formal sector. And I'll give you just a trite example. If you go and buy a cake in a high-end bakery in, say, Mumbai, India, you might not ever find out that the cake was actually made in a slum in Mumbai, right? The commodity itself is purchased by you in what would be considered the formal sector. Its production actually happens in the informal sector, and examples of this are legion. Everything, in fact, has these really dense, thick, heterogeneous connections with the informal. And this, I think, really begs the question how we imagine the growth miracle when we talk about the growth miracle, not just in India, but in countries like Brazil, in countries like India, in China, countries which are often hailed as the BRIC countries. So this is a landfill. Kristen talked about this. This is the largest landfill in Delhi. And I should mention that the work that I'm presenting in this phase of the talk has been in conjunction with an advocacy group in Delhi called Chintan, which works as an advocacy group for waste pickers, but also petty scrap dealers. So this is a large landfill, and it's become a kind of livelihood ecology. It supports an army of waste pickers who are sometimes derisively called scavengers. Delhi generates about 7,500 metric tons of garbage, what is called sort of solid municipal waste, every day. By comparison, New York generates about 12,000 tons. And from this waste, about approximately 150 to 200,000 waste pickers find a livelihood. This is a young picker at this landfill, and I can only imagine, Kristen, what kind of exposure they have, right, to developmental toxins. This is the basic structure of this informal waste economy, but I would argue that this pyramidical structure is common to many other informal economies as well. So the largest in number are these waste pickers who are going around scrounging this garbage and trying to salvage something from it that will produce an income for them. They go and sell what they salvage to these petty scrap dealers, and I really mean petty. I'll show you some photographs. One-room affairs, really. People who used to be waste pickers who through sheer toil and some amount of luck were able to save some money to find a room where they can actually store waste. And I'll come to why this ability to store is so important to the functioning of these waste economies. And then these petty scrap dealers will store waste and sell it onward in the commodity chain that Robert was talking about to warehouse owners who are really large dealers, right? And these warehouse owners in turn will sell this segregated waste, and I'll give you examples of waste, to factories and reprocessors who will then use those as inputs in many of the things that we might consume as part of the formal economy. Whether it's a water tank, whether it's a garden hose, or whether it's a plastic glass, and many other things besides. This is the value chain, right, a commodity chain, if you will, of waste, again, schematic. But what I want to point out is that all value chains, as Robert pointed out vividly, have a spatial architecture to them. And the spatial architecture of value chains differs from commodity to commodity, right? They're not identical, but it makes it all the more interesting to study. So in waste, for example, what is crucial is, of course, that your ability to generate livelihood from garbage depends a great deal on where you live. If you're walking around with a jute bag on your back in your catchment area, trying to find garbage either from households, door-to-door collection, or from roadsides, or railway embankments, or what you will, what have you, right? There's not much that you can do with a jute bag. It gets heavy pretty fast. And so your catchment area is very closely linked to where you live. So if you don't have security of livelihood, many of these folks are living in squatter settlements, that becomes a tremendous issue. It creates a precariousness to their existence. From that place of habitation, they chart a territorial route, often negotiated between waste pickers. They have to find a place to segregate this garbage, this amorphous mass of garbage, so that they can actually salvage value from it. It's dirty work. And then they need a place to store. Often waste pickers don't have a place to store because they're staying in these squatter settlements, which are, houses or shanties which are just abutting each other. There's no place whatsoever. So they have to sell their waste daily to some scrap dealer, this petty scrap dealer, who then stores the waste and sells it to a warehouse owner, who in turn sells it to a factory or reprocessor. Now, as you might have guessed from what I've already said, these waste economies have a certain economics associated with them, right, which are interesting in themselves. And they have certain rhythms associated with them. Now, these are the tricks of the trade, right? So what may seem on the face of it a pretty banal thing, when I first started learning about these waste economies, it just seems so mundane. But in fact, even in the most mundane of things, artistry can thrive. There is a certain virtuosity to work that can emerge. And the trick lies in purity, volume, and timing. So purity is where virtuosity thrives. And so among waste pickers, you have some waste pickers who are called, in Hindi, kalakars. Kalakars literally means artists. Why are they artists? Because they have this absolutely prodigious capacity built up through experience to sort through that amorphous waste to salvage value from it. And some of these old kalakars say that in fact there are about 150 different streams of waste that you can sort potentially from this amorphous mass of garbage, each with their own spatial architecture and commodity chains. And what they do, what's even more amazing is that when you see them sorting, they're not looking at this. Nobody has time to look. That's too slow. They are feeling it, texture. They shake it. Different plastics make different sounds. They sometimes bite it. So there is a whole different kind of sensory apparatus at work in this segregation process. What seems on the face of it totally banal is in fact an art. And it has to be. Otherwise you don't survive in this business. They go and sell this to a scrap dealer, and the more finely you've been able to segregate this waste, the greater the prices you're going to get from the scrap dealer, because in this very strange world of waste, purity matters, right? And the scrap dealer will take this waste, and here's why the capacity to store becomes so important, because of course the Chinese economy, among other factors, exerts a giant sucking sound on the waste economy, right? What happens in China redounds in the rest of the world. So prices for these different types of waste can fluctuate in time and space. And if you have the capacity to store, you can actually engage in some form of arbitrage, much like, a stock market broker. but not quite as digitally. But nevertheless, you can. And volume, again, becomes important because the more you're able to sell, the more the petty scrap dealer gets from the big honcho, the big warehouse owner. So purity, volume, and timing is really at the heart of this trade. And as I've said, kind of rather loudly in italics, geography matters. For businesses to work, segregation is key. For segregation to work, space for storage and separation is key. And I'm just going to show you a few photographs of things that you might never imagine as technology that actually enhances your capacity to generate a livelihood. A cycle cart. A cycle-drawn cart means that you don't have to go around collecting garbage in a jute bag on your shoulder, which is very tiring. And it not only increases the radius of your catchment area, it also increases the volume of waste that you're able to gather. This is a fully loaded cart, right? You want to make the best use of your time. You usually get to make one round every day, so you might as well make the best of it. And this is a picker who's sorting his wares, in this instance on the banks of the river Yamuna, which flows through Delhi. But its embankments offer one of the few public spaces where this waste can be sorted. And this is what I meant. This is a petty scrap dealer. As you can see, that room there, that is the petty scrap dealer's shop. And that's where he stores, right on the sidewalk. This is a bigger warehouse dealer who's actually annexed an alley in the older part of the city to store his waste. And this is a squatter settlement where people have grouped together to take up spaces, and they're storing waste sometimes collectively. And these are the different streams of waste I was talking about. This is scrap metal. This is plastics. And plastics are of many kinds. Auto trash, scrap paper, even old doors. And what's important to point out here is, of course, that this waste economy is incredibly heterogeneous, right? And as I've tried to underscore, livelihoods are incredibly precarious. And so I want to come back then to the title of my talk, The Right to Waste. And this right to waste, which is on the one hand, those who simply take it as their right to consume, to generate waste, and those who are actually trying to desperately build precarious livelihoods from it, are hugely affected by the workings of law, right? We might not think about this, but the workings of law has a tremendous impact on the spatial economics and rhythms of these urban waste economies. And I'm not going to go through all this. I'm sure your eyes are already glazing over and you're saying, oh no, please don't. But what I'm going to simply sort of try and emphasize here is that since the mid-1990s, which is approximately when India embarks on this process of economic reform, when it rolls out a series of policy measures that are associated with the deregulation of the economy and various forms of structural adjustment of the economy, is also the time when the judicial ethos undergoes a tremendous change. And this may not be completely coincidental because many of the judges are, at the end of the day, appointees. And many of these appointees, not surprisingly, share the predilections of those who appoint them. What also happens, of course, is something very interesting. In the mid-1970s, a particularly sort of progressive Supreme Court justice in India, the Supreme Court in India is very much like the Supreme Court here, Supreme Court justice in 70s introduced something that doesn't exist in this country, which is a public interest litigation, a judicial device that was meant to ease recourse to the law by precisely those people who don't typically have easy access to the law, right? Those who are marginalized, those who are poor. And the whole sort of genius of the PIL, as it's called, was that I could be anybody. All I had to do was write a petition on a piece of paper if I wanted, submit it to the Supreme Court, and ask for my grievance to be addressed. It's quite remarkable in that sense. Of course, what's happened is that this PIL device has been annexed by affluent middle classes who are using the PIL to essentially make all sorts of NIMBY cases, right? Not in my backyard cases. And what they're doing is they're invoking this clause in the Indian Constitution, Article 21, which is the right to life clause, very capaciously written, which essentially can be construed as anything. And they've filed a numerous series of PILs that have led to the rolling out of various sorts of rules that have really disenfranchised waste pickers, has made even more untenable the functioning of these waste economies. And this has been accompanied alongside by all sorts of slum demolition drives, so that if you are a squatter, your daily existence, which is uncertain to begin with, becomes even more uncertain because your work is so intimately connected to where you live, where you're able to move around, and a series of sealing drives by the municipal corporations in Delhi, which have been intended to shut down commercial establishments that are not in conformance with the city's master plan. Now, you may say, well, what's the big deal about that? Well, the problem is that there are a lot of activities that are not in conformance with the city's master plan, which are commercial. So, for example, many high-tech startups are operating in residential neighborhoods. They're not shut down. It's actually the scrap dealer, who is an eyesore, who is shut down. And the legal scholar Usha Ramanathan has described this, I think, quite well. She says the constitutionality that ensured every citizen the fundamental rights of livelihood, housing, and shelter has now been revised, reinvented, and supplanted by a legality that sees the urban poor as encroachers and a threat to civic existence. And I bet you could go to just about any city in the developing world, many of which have now embraced this aesthetic of transforming themselves into world-class cities, Rio de Janeiro being the latest instance, right, are engaging in these kinds of anti-poor policies. And what this has meant, of course, is it's completely disrupted the rhythms of these informal economies, and it has produced what I'm calling a chronopolitics, right, which is the politics of time. Some people's time is more valuable, and some people's time is less valuable. Some people's lives are worthier of acknowledgement, and some people's lives are really not that worthy of acknowledgement. Maybe they're simply surplus populations. And so it's led at the municipal level to privatization, corporate privatization of waste collection, the closure of these petty scrap dealerships, the relocation, really the expulsion of these slum dwellers to distant sites, sometimes relocated to places that are 15, 20 miles outside the limits of the city, where it becomes, as you can imagine, completely impossible to continue pursuing an activity that you had become familiar with over so many years, combined with all kinds of ordinances, right? Not laws, but these small ordinances that nevertheless have very disruptive effects. And I'm not going to spend time on this. You can come and talk to me later if you are interested, but Chintan, the advocacy group that I described, did some work trying to assess some of the impacts of privatization of waste collection, but also some of the other issues that I was discussing. What's happened most recently is, again, something that Kristen talked about, which is the introduction of 2 huge waste incinerators in Delhi, which has again led to the displacement of this waste, the garbage that these waste pickers depend on for survival. This is a famous slum demolition on the embankments of the river that flows through Delhi, which led to the displacement of approximately 300,000 people in the course of 2 days. Many of them were waste pickers. They were relocated to a site that was about 15 miles away, 15 to 20 miles away, with very poor transportation connections to the city. And one of the justifications that the courts used to endorse this demolition was that the slum was located on an environmentally sensitive area, right? That it was in a flood-prone zone. Well, they had no problems with the building of this on that same flood-prone zone just a year later. So what is to be done? And this is the final slide in case you're looking for relief. I just want to sort of bring it back to Calvino, Italo Calvino. In Leonia, this mythical city that Marco Polo describes to Kublai Khan, the street cleaners are treated by the residents like angels who observe their task of removing the residue of yesterday's existence by respectful silence, like a ritual that inspires devotion. Delhi, by contrast, is completely indifferent, apathetic, you might say, to its cleaners. And these are just some of the demands that have been issued by advocacy groups like Chintan, but there are many other advocacy groups that are working, which really try to sort of take this idea of the right to waste and turn it on its head and think of waste, the garbage that a city generates, as common property on which waste pickers have the first dibs. And it comes with a series of other demands that are meant to take what is a deeply precarious form of livelihood, and there are many of them, waste picking is just one of them, and make it just a little more certain to argue that these people who are poor, who are marginalized, who are stigmatized, are actually the conditions of possibility of existence for those who are affluent. And that's really the kind of ethical charge of their demand. Thank you.